Hello, everyone. I'm Renee Chiang, Vice President of the Oriental Ceramic Society of Hong Kong. We are very pleased to see so many of you joining us, not only from here in Hong Kong, but from London and elsewhere around the world. Welcome. The Chinese call the collecting of ancient artifacts giving them a second life, which is what I suppose you could say today's lecture is about. Our speaker, Professor Justin Jacobs of American University, may already be familiar to you from his previous books, including Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures, which he introduced to the OCS online 4 years ago, and now his new book, Plunder, How Museums Got Their Treasures, extends beyond China's northwest to the rest of the world to clarify the history behind the great Western museum collections, especially the least visible yet most prevalent forces. However you may feel about collecting ancient artifacts, provenance studies, or restitution, I think we can all agree that getting a better understanding of the actual complex history is helpful, besides being fascinating in itself, this second life of artifacts. Today, our hour will be divided into three parts. First, Professor Jacobs will present a short lecture, which will be followed by a conversation with Dr. Nicole Chiang, who is a curator at the Hong Kong Palace Museum and author of the historic study, Emperor Qianlong's Hidden Treasures. And after that, we'll have a Q&A, which you can all participate in. And as this is a Zoom meeting, I do ask viewers to please keep your microphones muted during the lecture and conversation. Now, welcome and thank you, Professor Jacobs, for getting up before the crack of dawn to introduce us to the topic of your new eye-opening book.
Thank you, Renee. Let me just a second here, and welcome to everyone from wherever you are in the world to today's session on my new book, Plunder: How Museums Got Their Treasures. It is a great delight to be able to come back here 4 years after I last introduced my previous book, The Compensations of Plunder: How China Lost Its Treasures. And today, I hope we have a very informative and insightful session. Thanks to Renee for helping to set this up, and to David Wong, and also a special thanks to Nicole Chiang for agreeing to serve as moderator. Very much looking forward to that. So I wanted to start off briefly with about 20 minutes or so, in which I will sort of talk about the origins of this book, this topic, how I got into this topic, and sort of the reasons why I feel like why do I have to write a second book on a topic that is very similar to the book that I introduced 4 years ago. Well, this all really sort of began almost 20 years ago now. It's actually shocking when I think of how long ago it was, when I was in my first semester of the PhD program in modern Chinese history at University of California, San Diego. My advisors, Joseph Escherich and Paul Pickowitz, they warned everyone who got in the program. They said, you're in the field of history, and the field of history, research projects take longer, pretty much than any other field in academia. You might be working on the same project for 10, 15 years of your life. So make sure that you can sustain your interest in your chosen topic for that long, or it's going to very quickly become an albatross. So I remember thinking at the time, all right, if this is going to be the next 10, 15 years of my life, I need to choose a topic that has some element of fun to it. And well, for me, 20 years ago, growing up in the suburbs of America, there wasn't anything much more fun than this guy, right? I mean, what's more fun than trying to escape from a boulder and whatnot? So, I thought, all right, I'm going to take this aspect and I'm going to see how can I apply this to a respectable academic topic so that it's fun and I don't get bored of this topic for the next decade. So really, my first published paper that I actually started working on in my first year of graduate school, way back in 2006, was the one aspect of Indiana Jones in history, so to speak, that I felt could be relevant to modern Chinese history, which was my chosen field of study. And I quickly learned that the Chinese themselves did not undertake scientific expeditions to uncover antiquities until the late 1920s. So it became apparent that if I wanted to trace the origins of any supposed Indiana Jones type figure in China, I'd have to start not with Chinese mirror images of Harrison Ford, but rather to Chinese reactions to the Western archaeologists who came in their midst, such as one of the most famous, of course, as you can see here in this photograph, Oral Stein, the Hungarian-born British archaeologist who undertook 4 expeditions to the northwestern region of Xinjiang. And as I started getting into the Chinese source space, what could the Chinese source space tell me about their reactions to these guys? I found something very surprising. I found that for the first 30 years of Western archaeological expeditions in China, from the 1890s to the 1920s, I couldn't find a single example in the Chinese source space where a Chinese voice was talking about the foreigners in a negative light. And more often, it wasn't simply that they were neutral or indifferent, they were often actively supportive and enthusiastic about what the Westerners were doing. And not only that, I also wanted to say, okay, well, maybe they just didn't know what was being removed for the most part. And although there are a few examples in which they didn't quite know what was being removed, I found that by and large, they had a pretty good idea of what was leaving the country. Just as one example that I show in my new book, and there's many other examples that we could talk about, in which Stein was actually quite open about publishing facsimiles of things that he had removed from China. And we know he gave these books as gifts to officials when he went back to China, and these were widely passed around and praised among Chinese officials. They did not regard the photographs in his books as evidence of a crime or a morally odious act. So eventually, I wrote up that decade, 10, 15 years of research into this topic into the form of my second academic monograph, the one that I introduced 4 years ago at the Oriental Ceramic Society, The Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures, that came out in 2020. And that traced what I found, Chinese responses to the Western archaeologists from about the 1890s to the 1930s. And back then, 4 or 5 years ago, I truly thought, all right, I'm done with this topic. 15 years of my life was quite enough, and that book would be my last word on the topic. But I found that my students at American University, where I teach, put a wrench in my plans. I wanted to sort of retire from all these controversies over museums and restitution debates and whatnot, but I continued to teach a course at American University. This is the course that I developed and that I teach every year or so at American University. It's an undergraduate course that I variously called at one time or another Indiana Jones in history. They wouldn't let me use that eventually. They said it needs to be more academically respectable to name. So I changed it to History of Archaeological Expeditions. And the original goal of this course was to force me, actually, to study Western collecting activities in parts of the world outside of China. I needed to make sure I didn't have sort of a narrow tunnel vision, only what I see in China. I wanted to be able to compare it with what was going on elsewhere in the world as well. And in the course of teaching this class year after year, over time, a couple of gaps in my original analysis became more and more apparent and troubling to me. I did try to ignore them at first because I wanted to move on to other research topics, but I got nagging doubts. Each time I would teach this course and lecture and whatnot to my students, I would think, you know what, there's a few things that I haven't quite worked out. Namely, what I discovered about Chinese responses to Western collectors in China didn't necessarily apply to all Western collectors. My focus had been on archaeologists like Oral Stein and Paul Paleo. But what about private collectors? What about diplomats? What about military plunder by soldiers? What about random peasant discoveries that nonetheless ended up in museums around the world? I'll give you an example. The oracle bones that were excavated from near the city of Anyang. Well, those were found about roughly the same time as the so-called cave library at the Mogao Grottos in Dunhuang. That was discovered famously in 1900 by the Taoist, the Taoist priest Wang Yuanlu. The oracle bones are often said to have been found by peasants in 1899. So a very similar time period, but the oracle bones were in the heartland of China, not out on the northwestern frontier. No Western archaeologist really had a hand in discovering or doing any of the initial excavations or digging of the oracle bones, the Shang Dynasty oracle bones. And yet, the oracle bones, nonetheless, met with more or less the same fate as antiquities that were unearthed by Western archaeologists in the deserts of northwestern China. That is, they ended up scattered around the globe. Some remained in China, some went abroad, but nevertheless, they kind of met with the same fate, but by a very different means. I knew it couldn't be the same as what happened on the expeditions in the Taklamakan Desert, but I didn't know how the means differ, differed from the expeditions. So in short, I realized I needed to account for the various distinct methods of collecting among a variety of historical agents that went beyond the scientific expeditions of Western scholars. For instance, expeditions, they get all the attention, such as this dramatic painting of Giovanni Belzoni removing the Memnon head from the sands of Luxor in Egypt. Expeditions get all the attention because they make for a great story. They're very dramatic. There are lots of popular books that you can easily find on the bookshelves about Giovanni Belzoni, or if we want to talk about China, Sven Hedin's daring adventures. Stein wrote popular books of 3 of his 4 expeditions, and they've been talked about a lot as well. But you can't really find a popular book about the dissemination of oracle bones around the globe. The only way I was really able to understand how the oracle bones ended up in different places was by reading an academic monograph in Chinese, because it wasn't an expedition that gets this sort of celebrity attention from these archaeologists. So all that is background to 2 years ago, 2022, when I was contacted out of the blue by an editor at Reaction Books in London to see if I would be interested in writing another book on what the editor referred to as, quote, the history of plunder. I don't quite think that when he asked if I wanted to write a book on the history of plunder, that he imagined the direction that I would take it. I think it was very straightforward. There was plunder, and this is the history of it. But I was intrigued by the possibilities of what I could do because I suddenly realized, you know what? I don't think I'm actually done with this story yet. This would be an opportunity to address a couple of troubling blind spots in my prior research. First, I could now expand my focus beyond archaeologists alone. Who else was responsible for the removal of art and antiquities from non-Western lands into museums in major Western cities? And I came up with the following list that I believe accounts more or less for the vast majority of what you see in any major Western museum. You've got scholars, the archaeologists, such as the Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, who worked for the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago for so many years. So scholars, that's one category. Another category, known to almost everyone in this field, you might say infamous, are dealers, such as C.T. Lu Qingjai, which I thought of as businessmen. All right, thinking in terms of their profession, what profession do they belong to, and not necessarily the title of the job that we associate them with. So we have scholars, we have dealers who are businessmen, then we have diplomats, such as these European diplomats who are British diplomats who are meeting with the Egyptian Pasha Muhammad Ali in the 1840s, and the sort of I wanted to highlight the diplomatic gifts that very often are gifted away to foreign diplomats in an attempt to sort of sweeten diplomatic deals. This is something that we do not value nearly as much as you value it, and it can create goodwill in tense diplomatic negotiations. And then, of course, there's probably the most famous one, soldiers. Soldiers are the ones who engage, I think, mostly in what we often think of as military plunder. That word plunder is thrown around quite a lot today. And what always vexed me the most is I thought, we use the word plunder too loosely. Yes, there are instances of plunder, but I don't think we should be applying that word to all means of collecting. These guys, American soldiers in the Forbidden City, absolutely. That fits under military plunder. But is that representative of all the means by which artifacts left source countries and got into Western museums? My research didn't seem to suggest that that was the case. But of these 4 agents of collection, scholars, dealers, diplomats, soldiers, I think one or more of these is ultimately the point of contact for most major Western museum acquisitions. And thinking of this in terms of profession rather than job title, a businessman rather than a dealer, was very helpful for me. Instead of thinking in terms of archaeologists, I could think of pretty much anyone who undertook an excavation or an expedition as a scholar. All right. Instead of military plunder, I thought of soldiers. Being a soldier in the military was your actual profession. That was your job. And this new lens brought into focus many factors that helped to explain for me the terms upon which the stuff that they collected left the source country by different means. They weren't all the same. Each one has a very unique and special set of circumstances, and we need to pay attention to that nuance so that we can pass an appropriate judgment of, in its own day and age, according to their terms in this profession and the value that they placed on these things, were they regarded as a morally odious act at the time period. It mattered greatly that scholars like Harvard art historian Langdon Warner, it mattered greatly that scholars as a class, as a group, were usually associated with higher institutions of learning who were often deeply sensitive to any suggestion that they were not acting in the best interest of science and humanity. This helped explain why it was so easy to obstruct men like Warner in 1925 when he went to Dunhuang, or Stein in 1930 to 31 on his fourth expedition to Xinjiang. It made it actually quite easy to obstruct them once a handful of prominent Chinese scholars in China decided to raise a ruckus about what they were doing. All they really had to say was, no, we don't believe you're acting in the best interest of science and humanity. And their institutional sponsors, in both cases here, it was Harvard at the time period, immediately recoiled and withdrew their support for the expedition quite swiftly. I was surprised at how easy it was to obstruct scholars once someone in the host country wanted to obstruct them. This then also brought into relief the near universal support and consensus that had existed previously, right? Nearly everyone, both Western and Chinese, thought that someone like Orlstein was acting heroically in the interest of science and never dreamed of obstructing him. Because it actually would have been quite easy to obstruct him if there was the impulse to do so in China in the early 20th century. Because when they chose to in the 20s and 30s, it was shockingly easy. I was surprised how easy it was to turn them away when they wanted to. If anything, at the time that he was undertaking his first three expeditions, they competed to be associated with him. And then I turned my lens beyond the scholars and I started thinking about antiquity dealers. Again, as a profession, I'm not thinking necessarily as their job title now, dealers. I'm thinking as a profession, they are businessmen. I could now interrogate the assumptions and the motivations of them as a profession. What do businessmen want? They want paying customers. All right. But the antiquities business was not a low end, we're selling cotton socks at 5 cents a bundle for 10 pairs of socks. They're kind of more similar to a luxury handbag company, I like to think of it, sort of like Gucci or something like that. I mean, there's only so many people in the world, on the planet in the 1920s, who could afford to spend $300,000 on a bodhisattva statue from the Song Dynasty. At one point, that was actually the price I think that I found for something that was purchased by Abby Rockefeller in the early 1930s. There aren't many people who could afford these sort of things. And very few of those people were Chinese at the time period, both by income and by inclination. Religious artifacts that were usually things worshipped by the Chinese masses, there was an ideological prejudice against collecting these sorts of things in the 1910s and the 1920s. This all helped to shed light on the businessman's mindset. He did not subscribe wholeheartedly to what we now think of as nationalist ideologies. He could not subscribe to those, or else he would go out of business. Nationalism, in that sense, would be bad for the businessman's profit margin. And international cosmopolitanism was his ethos. That is to say, anyone who appreciated Chinese art and could pay top dollar for it was a legitimate customer for him. And nothing was truly priceless to a businessman. He recognized that portrayals of antiquities as, quote, priceless symbols of the Chinese nation, he realized that was more a form of astute marketing, not necessarily an objective reality that guided his daily morality. Now, we may not agree with these beliefs today. They may not align with the values that we have been conditioned to believe in. But really, my goal as a historian, what I keep on telling myself that I'm trying to do, is I want to explain the past. I want to explain the past. I want to, as much as possible, not judge the past. And to do that, I try to reconstruct the original value system that existed at the time period. What was the value that the people, all the people who were involved in any particular means of transfer of art and antiquities from their source countries, when they left these countries and went abroad into a Western museum? I try to get a lineup of all the people who were involved at every point in these transactions, and figure out, to the best of my ability, according to sources that come from that day and age, what did everyone think about this? What value did, if any, what value, if any, did they place upon the object that was being removed? And what sort of incentives did they need to be provided with in order to willingly part with these things? And so I apply this framework. I apply this approach to all four of these different types of professions in my book. So there's 3 chapters to the book, and the first chapter deals with diplomats and soldiers. So diplomats oftentimes are the recipients of diplomatic gifts, and I examine all the assumptions, what's going on there, the degree of willingness, the values that were placed on this by the parties that are involved, and I examine very famous artifacts like the Elgin marbles, and then I turn to soldiers, and I openly acknowledge that when I talk about the soldiers, is absolutely one category of artifact transfer that even at the time period was regarded as morally odious. It's not like we needed to wait 100 years for people to finally realize, oh yeah, the sacking of the old summer palace was not one of our finest moments, and that was pretty bad. Even at the time period, that was criticized. But I find with the other 3 groups of collectors that if we adopt the approach of their own day and age, it's not just the collectors who thought, it's not just the Western collectors who thought that what they were doing was okay and admirable. More often than not, what I ended up finding is that people in the source country, from illiterate, impoverished peasants all the way up to highly educated, wealthy Chinese scholars, um, often felt the same way. And so the framework that I've adopted here is what I refer to as the compensations of cooperation, which essentially says that at the time period, as long as the foreigners were offering things in return that were perceived at the time period by the people in the source country as being more valuable in their eyes, not our eyes, more valuable in their eyes at the time period than what was being removed, they would willingly and often enthusiastically and voluntarily help remove things from their country. And I find that of the 4 groups that I talk about, really it's only the soldiers. It's really only the soldiers who were criticized even at the time period that this was taking place, and that the diplomats, the scholars, and the dealers very much were acting in accordance with the value system of their day. And that most people who were alive then, if they could see how that age and their activities were being talked about today, would be quite surprised. They would be quite surprised to find that the negotiations, the dealings that they were involved in, are under, sort of the subject of intense criticism today. What we need to understand is that I think our ancestors collectively throughout the world did not necessarily share the same views that we have today. And only by reconstructing their views of the value of antiquities in their own day and age can we truly appreciate why they chose to cooperate with Westerners and let so many treasures, what we now see as priceless treasures, but they often did not, why they let these leave their countries in a way that was not necessarily regarded as a morally odious act at the time period. I'll stop there. I think I've reached my 20-minute allotment, and let me end my slides so we can get out here and turn it over to Nicole Chiang, who has very kindly agreed to moderate the next segment of our session today. So, Nicole, and
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor Jacobs, for this intriguing talk, and congratulations on the new publication. Illicit movement of cultural properties and ownership of antiquities have been hot topics for many, many years. Even back when I studied for my MA degree in museum studies at the Corto Institute of Art, my supervisor warned my class that we should not attempt to resolve problems such as the restitution of the Elgin marbles in our MA thesis, and the topic would be too huge. While your book does not really take a stance on as to whether the Elgin marbles or any other antiquities should or should not go back to their places of origin, the book does help shed new light on how we approach the widely discussed issues of plunder, theft, and restitution, and it helps readers understand the original context of the removal of objects from Egypt, from Easter Island, and of course China. And these issues have been hotly debated for decades. So I'm just wondering why people had not tried to restore the historical context before. Is it because the research materials were not available? Is it because the topic seems so obvious that people have neglected to check the attitudes of the historical figures involved?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's one that I've been trying to answer for a very long time myself. And I think there's two reasons. The first reason is the one that you have suggested, is that the materials that you would need sort of to find what we might think of as a smoking gun, sort of the evidence of, wow, this really shows that they thought something, that they thought differently about these things 100 years ago. The most important evidence that you need for that is you need to find non-Western voices in the source country in different languages. And so you have to have the language training to be able to read these other languages. And these things were not easily discoverable. Eventually, as I got into this project and I worked on it for many, many years, once I already sort of smelled the blood in the water and I found my first examples, sort of, so to speak, of, wow, I think the Chinese thought very differently about these things. Once I found that, then I was attuned to it and I was looking and I was able to find other materials, other archives in which I was able to accumulate more Chinese voices that were echoing the same views. But the first ones were very hard, and it was only discovered really by chance. It was when I was doing a research trip to the Bodleian Library in Oxford in 2013, actually. And I was just there to look at Stein's unpublished field diary from his fourth expedition. And I remember I went there and I saw in this list of like 400 boxes of materials they had from the Stein archives, there was one that simply said Chinese docks, and it was the only one that said that. And I remember thinking, "Ooh, I wonder what's in there." And I requested it and opened it up, and I was blown away. It was like well over 100 documents, almost all in Chinese, of the various sort of letters and whatnot that he had collected from Chinese officials, documentation, and that's where I found those letters from Chinese officials in Xinjiang that they were writing to him, and they were gushing. They were gushing letters expressing their admiration for what he was doing. They often revealed that they had seen what he was taking away, and that they praised him for his motivations in doing this. And so that to me really blew me away. And once I found those letters, that's when I started realizing, you know what, now I need to be on the lookout for this. So that was almost by accident, really. I did not even know that those sort of materials even existed. Once I knew they existed, then I searched them out deliberately in Chinese archives and I was able to find more. But I wasn't even aware that that stuff could be found. And so that's the second reason then. Why was I not aware of that? Why had it not even occurred to me to think that I could find sources like this? And that really, I think, is just with the passage of time. We very quickly forget what the values were of previous generations, and we are conditioned with the new values of our own day and age. And that colors the lenses of what we look for and the possibilities that we can even imagine of what we might research. When I first got into this topic, and I was thinking, way back in grad school, Indiana Jones and history, that would be a fun topic. Let me see what I can do in Chinese history with that. I assumed that when I started getting into the source space, that I would find that the Chinese from 100 years ago regarded Stein in the same way that he is often regarded today. I thought I was going to see that they were calling him a thief, that they were very upset that these things were leaving leaving the country because I had been conditioned to believe that by the discourse of my own day and age that I had been brought up with. And so I think it simply oftentimes doesn't even occur to people of a certain generation to think that people of a prior generation may have regarded something in a very different light, especially if we have very strongly held views about that today. It just seems like a self-evident truth. So the source material is very hard to find, and I stumbled upon it initially by accident. You also have to be able to read non-Western languages, and then you also have to have the ideological inclination to believe that different views like this can even be found.
Interesting. Well, for such an ambitious book with such a huge topic, it's surprisingly easy to read. I read it over Christmas.
Oh,
I
thank you.
think part of the reason is that your book provides many interesting case studies from Dunhuang manuscripts to Cleopatra's Needles, which many people are familiar with.
Mm.
And with these cases, you illustrate a global phenomenon. Westerners brought the Enlightenment ideology to non-Western regions, changed the local attitude of finders keepers, and promoted the status of antiquities from precious to priceless, particularly after World War I, when the concept of a nation started to emerge. And it's quite ironic in a way, isn't it? Westerners kind of planted the seeds of their own defeat.
Mm.
But we live in the 21st century after all, and most people do see cultural properties as national symbols. And there's a popular saying in China, no Chinese person can walk out of the British Museum with a smiling face. So how have people in different regions or of different backgrounds reacted to this book?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. So I've had a couple of surprising interactions with scholars in China. I wasn't necessarily sure how my research would be received, but there's been a couple of things that have been very surprising for me. Back in 2016, I was invited to go to Sichuan University in Chengdu and give a series of talks in Chinese. And one of the three talks that I gave was on this topic, actually. And I gave an hour-long talk on all the major research findings that I had on the archaeologist at that time period, and I found that scholars were actually quite receptive to it. There was a diversity of opinion. There were certainly, there's definitely the one or two grad students who stood up and wanted to let me know that this was all theft and that I should be condemning it and whatnot. But that was by no means the only response that I got, and there were many people who were very intrigued by the source material. I think what was important is that I had Chinese documents. There's two ways to approach this topic. You find the non-Western voices in non-Western languages. That's the most important one. That's the one that has the most impact as well. But there's another more subtle way you can, not more subtle, but you have to use subtle means, is you can look at the Western source base and sort of read against the grain and try to read between the lines and see, can I tell through the Westerners what the locals are thinking, or how they value these things? That would not have been as an effective a means. I really needed to have the Chinese materials for that. So there was that interaction. And then their Peking University Press actually is translating the book, and it's going to come out in Chinese, I've been told, this year. And there was a scholar at Beijing University who took an interest in the book and was largely responsible for shepherding it through to translation. So the fact that it is going to be translated into Chinese actually blew me away that that could even happen. I have not yet seen the list of things where they're probably going to ask me to see if I'm willing to edit out some of the passages. I have not yet seen that, so maybe once I see that, I'll change my tune here. So that both of these things were an indication to me that there is a receptive audience for these sorts of views that challenge some of the cardinal assumptions that often have been a part of nationalist ideologies in China for the past century. Outside of China, I've actually had some interesting views as well. One thing that I did notice that sort of bothered me a bit, I guess, after the last book came out, is I would notice that among both scholars and the general media, I would find that the one aspect of my research got a disproportionate amount of attention that I thought somewhat overshadowed the main arguments that I was making, I would often find that the racism, the racist attitudes of the Western archaeologists and the various collectors would get a lot of prominence in various scholarly reviews of my work, and journalistic media treatments and whatnot. Typically, it happened over and over again. I would be on the phone with a journalist for like an hour. We would talk about some of the unpleasant racist ideologies of men like Stein and whatnot for maybe 30 seconds, and then the entire article would be about that. And I was surprised by that because for me, 95% of the research that I've been undertaking was to try to explain why people in the host countries did not object to these things leaving the country by and large. And then the narrative that seemed to get out there about what I was actually doing was, oh, Justin Jacobs shows beyond a doubt how racist these guys were. And that's true. They had some pretty unpleasant ideas and attitudes about people in the world. But that wasn't actually the main thrust of what I was talking about. And although that's unpleasant and it should be acknowledged, I don't think that the unpleasant racial attitudes of these Western archaeologists actually mattered in the interactions with people in the source countries as to what their motivations were to work together with them. They may have motivated why Westerners went after certain types of objects. We're going after Gandharan art because we see traces of Alexander the Great and the march of Western civilization into Central Asia. That it was influential in that sense. But if you want to understand why did a Chinese official in the, Urumqi think of Stein so highly? Why did C.T. Liu, was he so willing to sell these things to Abby Rockefeller and whatnot? I don't think that aspect of these collecting activities is actually very relevant. It doesn't help to shed light on why people are engaging the compensations of cooperation. So yes, it's always weird when you do research. I'm sure you know this, and any scholar really who has done research is aware of this, is that what you think you're doing is one thing, and then the way that it gets reframed and reinterpreted by other people is quite another matter.
It's quite an interesting reaction from the press.
Yeah, that happened over and over again. So it was especially acute with the media. I go on and on about the compensations of cooperation and what's going on and all this, and then you mentioned, oh, by the way, yeah, he had some pretty unpleasant views of this, and then the entire article would be about that, and I was like, really? It's not wrong. It's not wrong. It just distorts what we're actually trying to talk about here.
Oh, so good that we have your original voice here. Also, as a museum curator, I often have to deal with provenance and the UNESCO 1970 Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural properties prevents museums from acquiring or exhibiting cultural properties whose legal ownership cannot be traced back to at least 1970. Part of the reason is to prevent various parties from benefiting from illegal removal of cultural properties. But as what you argue in the chapter on dealers, people, well, not necessarily thieves, they simply sell objects to a customer who can offer the highest price, regardless of his or her nationality or ethnicity. So it just makes me wonder how effective the 1970 convention is. Morally speaking, I guess it helps, but in reality, antiquities are still traded not only for money, but for various forms of compensation, as you described so well in the book. What responsibilities do you think museums, auction houses, and collectors take within this discourse?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard an echo. That chapter on dealers was probably the most new territory for me to cover, and the one that I was most anxious about because I knew it was the biggest blind spot in my research. Because dealers are hard to study. Dealers are hard to study. They're not institutions of higher learning. They don't have archives necessarily. I tried to get into some of C.T. Liu's archives and found very quickly that they weren't too eager to open those up, and there's not a whole lot you can really do. It's not like the Bodleian Library where they almost have an obligation, an obligation. If a legitimate scholar comes in, we have to share these materials with them. And as I started to look at what I could find about dealers and their supply chain, I reevaluated the people who collect these things on the ground level in a way that was very surprising to me. I did not expect to go in this direction, but it is the direction that the evidence that I was able to uncover brought me to, which was essentially that the words that often get thrown around to talk about the people who collect these things on the ground level and sell them illicitly and whatnot, they're often routinely referred to as grave robbers, as tomb raiders, and these are pejorative words that have ingrained within them a value judgment that says that what you're doing is illegitimate. Well, illegitimate from whose point of view? Well, when you start thinking about this, you realize, well, it's illegitimate from the point of view of a nationalist platform that says that everything that comes out of the ground and is an ancient material remain automatically belongs to the nation. That's who's being betrayed, is this abstract idea of the nation. Well, how do we get a condition to believe in nationalist ideologies? We are educated usually in schools, and the poorest people among us, who are often digging up ancient tombs and agricultural fields and whatnot, are often the most impoverished and the least educated among us. And the conclusion that I came to is that the dealer network thrives because a great many number of people do not subscribe to the sanctity of nationalist ideologies in the way that people like us here have been conditioned to believe in. And if you don't necessarily subscribe to those nationalist ideologies and view these things as priceless emblems of the nation, if you can start viewing them in other ways that to them are not illegitimate. This is a meal ticket. This is a way to raise themselves out of poverty. And the analytical framework that I invoked to analyze this segment of society was one that tries to get us to think of these people in different terms, not use loaded terms like tomb raiders and grave robbers, but to refer to them as subsistence diggers. Subsistence diggers is the term that I use in the book as well, to highlight the economic imperatives of their condition and why they're doing what they do, and to suggest that the way that they view the value of these things is not necessarily illegitimate. It's just illegitimate from a particular perspective that is very much in fashion among the global media and educated scholars and museum curators and whatnot. Their perspective isn't necessarily illegitimate. So what I found is, and I say this in the book, the archaeologists were easy to stop. They were actually the easiest of all of them. There was a very clear end date for Western unilateral archaeological expeditions in non-Western countries. It's in the decade or two after World War I. Once you wanted to stop them, people in the host country simply had to say no. That was it. The dealer network, though, it's impossible to stop because you have millions of people. As long as there are poor people in remote rural areas who think that they can improve their lives by turning the remains of the past into a day's wages, that network, which we call illicit, but I don't think we should use the words like that. Those networks, those supply chains will continue to thrive. And quite honestly, I know that this is not the sort of statement that people want to hear. I don't think it can be stopped. And the more that I look into the conditions of the supply chain itself, I have a difficult time even saying that it should be stopped. I feel very elitist. I feel like I'm coming in with my highfalutin ideas about this priceless nation that only exists in our minds and whatnot. And I'm telling them, yeah, you should value that over your impoverished daily lives and the opportunity to pull yourself out of this. So yeah, it's definitely a case of the more you learn about it, the harder it is to do anything, to take a position. You almost feel intellectual paralysis about it.
I think we've reached the end of this session. So
Oh,
one
wow, that flew by.
quick question. So if
Yes,
there's
sorry.
one thing you wish readers can take away from this book, what would it be?
The one thing that I hope readers can take away from the book is more nuance. I really, the thing I want people to take away more than anything else is to understand that when you walk into a museum, all the things that you see, there is no one narrative that can account for how they all got there. Because that is the most frustrating and troubling aspect of modern present day discourses on the restitution debates and whatnot. I try as hard as possible to not actually take, you know, uh, clear positions on, oh yes, this should be returned, this shouldn't be returned, anything like that. Really, what I want to be able to do is to recover the original context, the values of a different day and age, so that people know that there are different stories and different means by which all of these things got into a Western museum. Some I believe probably a minority, a visible minority, but still a minority. Some were absolutely morally odious plunder, and they were regarded that way 100 years ago, 200 years ago as well. But I don't believe that most are. I believe that most, if you interrogate the original context and the people who were involved and what they thought about it, and don't project our values back in time, you will find that they are not so heavily criticized. In fact, it may be the exact opposite. And I would like people to refrain from using one, brushstroke to say that everything inside a museum was obtained a certain way. Usually, those brushstrokes are to say it's all plunder, it's all morally odious. And I'm not saying that there isn't some that isn't. I'm saying that it's complicated, as any historian should say, right? Is that it's nuanced, it's complicated, and I hope my book will help people to understand the various pathways and considerations that were involved in how these things got there.
Oh, great. Well, I'm sure our audience have lots of questions as well, so we'll open the floor for questions. You're welcome to raise your digital hand or put your questions in the chat box.
So we have one, Edith Terry is raised. So just unmute, Edith, and ask your question.
So my question is really for both of you. These issues also relate to social constructs, one of which is the museum. The whole notion of a museum is basically one 19th century, maybe a little bit earlier, and it's evolving in new directions now. So one of the interesting episodes in your book, Justin, was now I read it a few months ago. Now I'm a little bit fuzzy on the detail, but where the Ottomans, I think, established a museum, and all of a sudden they turned on a dime. It was no longer okay to take objects in their under their jurisdiction. They had to go to their museum, and that was a national symbol. So museums have evolved from being sort of warehouses of ethnographic assemblage and very colonial in orientation to nationalism, and now maybe to sort of a digital future when the walls, something within actual walls, is no longer that important. But can you comment at all on how we should look at the museum as one of the sort of an important lens to view, I guess, the ethics of collection, the ethics of extraction of antiquities from their source locations, which continues today, obviously. Ask Sotheby's, ask Christie's. Anyway.
Right. So the issues that you touch upon here, really the ones that I find most fascinating is that you're absolutely right, that the role of the museum has changed significantly over the past 200 years. Very much, as you say, it starts off as sort of a product of the Western Enlightenment, and then very quickly becomes a symbol of Western empires. And then once non-Western countries begin to imitate this institution, such as the example you bring up, the Ottomans. They, treat these the antiquities the same way, priceless symbols of the various nations that they represent. They are politicized, and it is interesting to think about how museums change. And I'm often asked questions such as, well, okay, since we acknowledge that the Western Museum has a colonial origin, and was very complicit in putting forth so many racist, pejorative ideologies about other people throughout the world. Isn't it then, shouldn't we embrace the idea that the formerly colonized countries of the world themselves, when they create their museums, that it should also be allowed to serve as a point of pride, as something that can help unite this nation and push back against Western imperialism and whatnot. That is certainly a valid point. I certainly acknowledge that museums have served a lot of different politicized views at different times over the past 200 years or so. The other part of your question, though, you were saying to comment on the ethics of museums. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I wasn't quite sure what aspect of that you were hoping for a comment on.
Okay, no, maybe the question is too vague in my own mind as well. But once you have the widespread digitization of collection, the actual sort of physical location of the museum and its environment, in some ways become universalized, at least accessible to anyone with a computer. So does that change the ethical equation? I mean, you're speaking to sort of woke perceptions about the evils of museums established in the colonial era that continue today. But the new question should be different, I think. It has something having more to do with accessibility, the sort of I guess digital equality in terms of accessibility. And yet there's still a passion for things. So the Chinese in particular have been rehoming objects as fast as they can. Sometimes with some very squirrely motive and corrupt motivations. But do you think the digitization of the digital museum sort of changed the ethical equation?
Yeah, I think I understand a little bit better. I would say that I think that there is still a great deal of the perception of authenticity in the physical object, that although museums throughout the world are digitizing things and they can be accessible throughout the world, they are still advertised. They are still framed as the priceless emblems of various nations and their artistic genius and their heritage for the people and whatnot. And although everyone is encouraged to share and appreciate and admire that, I still think there is great cultural cachet, so to speak, in the authenticity of who owns the physical object and putting it on display. We still have the brick and mortar museums, the major museum institutions around the world still get millions and millions of people who walk into these buildings every single year, and they are still the focal points of political activism as well. When people want to make a statement, political statement, and they want to use museums to do it, they go into the museum and they throw tomato soup on the physical object itself. And so I still think, even in the age of digitization, that there is still great importance that is placed on the authenticity of the physical ownership of the actual material object. Nicole, did you want to comment on that or not? Or
well, yes, I totally agree with you. And an interesting case you mentioned in the book is Prime's Treasures, whose disputed ownership involves the Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey, Greece, Germany, and Russia. And in this case, we see that objects can be carried from one region to another, borders may shift and politics may change. So a lot of different elements add to the complexity of determining ownership. So yeah, digitization is probably just one of it, but I think I agree with with Professor Jacobs, that the authenticity of objects still play a very important role.
Thank you for the question. Any others?
I don't see any other questions or hands raised right now, but
Oh, there's one.
oh, here's one. So the question is in the chat, would you mind sharing a bit about the reactions your books generated, if any, from the Western museums and or the supply sectors, i.e. scholars, dealers, auction houses, etc.?
Yeah, good question. And I would love to know that myself. If you know anyone who works at auction houses and actual dealers, and I would love to know what their reactions are to it. Really, that question is one where I sort of already sort of addressed that a little bit with Western media, some Western scholars, and then reaction among scholars in China as well. But as far as the reaction among people who actually work in museums or auction houses and dealers and whatnot. No, not yet, not so far. The book's been out for I guess it came out in the UK in August, and it's only been out in the United States since October. So I guess we're still in the early stages. But I actually don't really know how it's been received. I'm quite curious myself if people who actually work in museums in these fields, what they think of my arguments and the evidence and whatnot. I'm just as curious as you are.
Perhaps we may have some of those type of people online today, and welcome their feedback to your book. So any other questions or hands? Since you were talking about authenticity, I think another thing that has changed the ideas about the moral attitudes towards this compensations of cooperation, as you put it. It's a very, very lively business still. So, but the frauds that have been made, the forgeries of the old antiquities seems to add another level of confusion to a already kind of gray area. I know you looked into some of the dealers' stories.
Yeah.
Of the Chinese dealer stories, which is something that's I don't think anyone in English has written about before. But do you have any insight about how the forgeries sort of play into the rest of the idea of authenticity and how museums collect?
For me, the issue of forgeries was most important in simply showing that there really is no substitute for the physical object. You can talk about it, you can reproduce it. In the old days, it wasn't digitization necessarily, but it was sort of, facsimiles and books and publishing images of these things. You could still get access to that sort of stuff. But for me, the forgery business just shows that the desire for the authenticity that is believed to reside in a physical object that was touched by our collective ancestors of 2,000 years ago is so strong that the actual supply of authentic stuff that really is old is insufficient to meet that demand. And it's such an insatiable desire to have these physical emblems of contact with our imagined ancestors that entire forgery businesses can rise up and flourish. And this is not new at all. This is anyone who studies Orelstein and his expeditions will remember the story of Islam Akun, the Muslim man in the Taklamakan Desert who forged all of these made-up languages that were supposedly dead languages, and he had a whole business that went on for several years selling to all of these very intelligent Western collectors, highly educated men who nonetheless wanted this stuff so bad that they were easily duped by someone who had no formal education living in the deserts of northwestern China. And Stein was the one who eventually uncovered that. And when I was doing the research for this book and I was starting to learn a little bit more about the supply chains and methods of Chinese dealers, and Renee, you were actually the one who to tip me off to some of the best sources that I could use to be able to look into the business. I couldn't get into C.Tu Lu's archives, but the next best thing was the recollections and memoirs of Chinese dealers like Chen Zhongyuan. And when I started reading their accounts as well, some of you who have read the book, you might remember it, but one of the most just delightful research, sort of discoveries that I had. I was like, oh, isn't that fascinating? Is when you get these discussions among Chinese dealers among themselves in which they're talking about, we can't authenticate whether this is real or not. It may be a forgery. It may be a fake. Well, what's the solution to that? Sell it to gullible Americans. They'll buy it. And that to me was another one of these wonderful examples of the nuance and complexities that are involved when we think about the various paths by which things left their source countries and went abroad. Sometimes it can be because foreigners were believed to be more gullible, would pay higher prices for things that were not authenticated as necessarily actually dating from as long ago or being owned by a historical figure as we thought they did. So yeah, forgeries have been around for a long time, and it just speaks to how insatiable the demand is for the physical object and the authenticity that it is believed to represent. And that ties into the nations that we then associate these things to.
Well, actually, it's 8 o'clock, so if there are no more questions, well, maybe just let me ask one more then. How does modern or contemporary art come into this game of nationalism and museums?
That's actually a really good question. I'm glad that you asked that because there are certain things. I'm not actually studying all things in all museums. I actually have a very particular type of lens of analysis. I am looking at basically objects that came from non-Western lands and were transported into major Western museums because that gets into the issue of your crossing cultural and ethnic boundaries, and that's where the nationalist ideologies become relevant. Okay, if we're crossing these boundaries, then does this belong in the land where it was created? And I don't necessarily think with a lot of other forms of artwork, European art that has been stolen by Nazis, that sort of stuff, is not really in the same category because you don't necessarily get the same sort of dynamics involved when we're talking about taking things from China. The other major area that I do not look at, and I'm fully aware that it's not something that I looked at, and I think it should be looked at, but I think it's beyond my range of expertise, is indigenous artifacts. That's also not the area of my chief concern, primarily because there's a couple of things that I think are different about that. That I think, one, the power dynamics are quite different as well. Maybe not at the beginning. When Captain Cook goes into the Pacific and he meets the Hawaiian chief for the very first time, well, those power dynamics are actually quite evenly balanced at first contact. Captain Cook was killed himself. He didn't necessarily have the upper hand. So I do believe actually that instances like that, and I included one of those in my book, are similar. But later on, as those relationships progress and disease and warfare takes its toll, I think it's a very different dynamic involved. When someone is selling, a necklace of beads or giving it away, and 9 out of every 10 people in their village has died from measles or smallpox, the power imbalance, the incentives are wildly different, I think, at that point, from what we see in a place like China or Egypt or other parts of the world that were not so devastated. So I did make a conscious decision that most of those, I think, it simply requires a different area of expertise. You need a scholar who is actually, had been studying indigenous societies for a much longer time period, is aware of the dynamics and power dynamics. I think it should be done. I would love to see a study like that done. But it's beyond my purview to do that, I think. Edith, you have your hand up.
So the question is, you described your three principles as all as collectors, or you used that word. But I wondered if you had thought about looking at motivations and processes from the point of view of what we normally think of as collectors, individuals who amass collections, not necessarily in museums or for museums. So have you
Yeah.
thought about exploring that avenue?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question. I'm glad you brought that up because it's not something I explicitly address, but I do believe that it is covered by my four different types of collecting agents, specifically because I don't think it's common for private individual collectors, usually wealthy, to be going off into places like China or Egypt acquiring pretty important artifacts, and then they stay in those families forever. One way or another, those people are usually interacting with one of my four agents of collection. They are going through dealers. They know a Western diplomat. They have bought it at an auction house, and the auction house has gotten it from a soldier who took it from military plunder. And I think that eventually, when these things do go into a private collection, if they end up in a museum, one day they'll be donated there, oftentimes bequeathed there or sold there by the people that own it. But I do think that individual wealthy owners who acquire these collections, they themselves have more often than not gone through one of my other human conduits to acquire that thing in the first place. They've gone through the scholars, the diplomats, the soldiers, or the dealers themselves. And so I'm just trying to ultimately trace it to one of these agents. And I do think that most of that is accounted for by the four collecting types that I've identified.
We do have one more question and then we'll wrap it up from Ian Clark. Have you been able to consider and include in your framework Zhou Enlai's 1950s gift of Chinese antiquities to East Germany, now in Berlin?
No, I actually was not aware that he had done that. I sort of wrap up my analysis in the 1930s because that's when the major shifts that get to our present day age have already been come about. But simply the wording alone in your question makes me think that that very easily can fit into the diplomat category. That this is a classic case of a diplomatic gift that is probably East Germany being given from one like-minded communist official to another as a symbol of the genius, blood, sweat, and tears of the Chinese people. Now, the meaning of that gift, the specific symbolism that it would have had at that time period, is probably very different than we might think of it today. It almost certainly would have been seen as, okay, yes, this is a symbol of the exploiting feudal class. Nevertheless, it still represents the taxes, the artistic genius, the blood, sweat, and tears of the Chinese people in the collective that were able to create the resources that ultimately produce this exquisite treasure, even if it would have had that sort of Marxist gloss that would have been attached to it at the time period. But to me, I'm sure if I looked into that, that would be a classic instance of a very modern diplomatic gift. Diplomatic gifts don't stop in the 1930s. As late as 1965, Egypt gives a diplomatic gift of the entire Temple of Dendur to the United States, which then deposits it in the Metropolitan Museum in New York as thanks for U.S. engineering help with a dam project that was going to flood that temple. Diplomatic. So it's actually. I'll actually finish with this. One of the things I was most surprised of is that almost all of the three of the four collecting agents continue today. The only one that was ever stopped was unilateral Western expeditions because they were really easy to stop. They were associated with institutions of higher learning that were very sensitive to criticisms, that they were not acting in the best interests of science and humanity. All you had to say no to do was say no to them. But you can't just say no to dealers and their networks because if there's impoverished people who don't believe in nationalism, they're going to provide the supply chain. You can't say no to soldiers. If there's a war, there's going to be plunder. It's just going to happen. And although most politicians, they have to subscribe and give lip service to nationalist ideologies, politicians are professional liars and hypocrites, to be honest, and they are very, at ease with giving things away. They'll turn around and say to their people, "This is a priceless symbol of your nation and my legitimacy," and then they'll, turn 180 degrees and they'll give something away as a gift to another country. So diplomatic gifts, you can't really stop either if a diplomat decides they're going to do it. So actually, 3 out of my 4 methods of antiquity removal are still in vogue today. They're just a little more hush-hush and not so open.
including soldiers, Plunder?
Well,
So
if
that's
you have war, the soldiers
true.
are still going to take stuff. When Iraq was invaded, we saw what happened to the museum in Baghdad.
Yeah, that's true.
That was only 20 years ago. We don't have those kind of wars as much anymore. But when there's political instability and soldiers running around, that still happens.
Hmm. Well, thank you, Justin, for that wonderful talk and getting up so early. And thank you, Nicole, for moderating a discussion. And thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much, Renee, for organizing this, David, for helping with logistics, and a special thanks to Nicole as well for serving as moderator. It's been a pleasure, everyone.